So I'm hitting record for Brandon. I will now turn it over to Dr. Torres for opening remarks from Brandon's chair.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson-Faya. Would like to welcome everyone to today's event. It's been a pleasure working with Brandon for the last 3 years. He is very knowledgeable about this topic, and I want to thank Dr. Andy Garcia, the methodologist, and Dr. Tanel Porter, our practitioner. We really appreciate the expertise that you two bring to the table. I'd also like to thank Dr. Thompson and Dr. Green for providing the technology support. So Brandon, at this time, I want you just relax. You know more about this topic than some of us on the committee. So make sure that you're relaxed. You tell us what to do. So basically the format, the first 15 minutes, we've already seen chapter 1, 2, and 3, but the audience has not had privy to that. So I want you just to bring them up to date. And then 20 minutes for chapter 4. Those are your results. That's what we're interested in finding out. We gave you permission to do the study when you did your proposal. And now what we're doing is we want to find out what you found, what were the results, and then spend another 20 minutes on your chapter 5, your implications, your conclusions, and your recommendations. So at this time, Brandon, why don't you welcome your guests that are on video, and then we'll talk to them later after the defense.
Sure. Well, thank you for everybody who's able to watch this. I'm glad I can't see you because that'll be difficult enough to present everything. But thank you for to the committee for just giving me the opportunity to do this, and for anybody who's able to watch. You're muted, Jessica.
Thank you. Dr. Torres, Dr. Porter, or Dr. Garcia, do you have any comments before we turn it over to Brandon? Dr. Torres, we're good to go? We're good to start?
We'll turn it over to Brandon.
Okay, hopefully future Dr. Brandon Warren, we're turning it over to you. You can go ahead and share your screen.
So my study was on the intellectual character of the formerly incarcerated. I focused on 3 elements of intellectual character, that being intellectual humility, open-mindedness, and moral reasoning. This image is a rendition of Boethius, who was wrongfully imprisoned and executed. And during that time, he wrote one of the more important works in medieval philosophy. Just briefly about myself, this research is important to me because I was also incarcerated for several years between the ages of 16 and 24. So I finished a GED while in prison and earned an Associate of Arts while in prison. Since then, I've finished a Bachelor of Counseling, a Master of Divinity in Theology. And in addition to this doctoral program, I've been working on another Master of Philosophy that I hope to finish in December. And for the last 10 years, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice has graciously allowed me to teach inside the prison system as an administrator and adjunct professor for college and prison programs. So this perspective by Martin Luther King Jr. sort of encapsulates my perspective on education and character education as a whole. When he says the most dangerous criminal may be the man gifted with reason, but with no morals, intelligence plus character. That is the goal of true education. For the purposes of my study, intelligence is synonymous with cognitive qualities, and character is synonymous with non-cognitive qualities. My central research question was just asking whether there was a statistically significant relationship between educational achievement and intellectual character. It was a correlational study, so effect size is there. And then I also say something about power. But by educational achievement, I just mean years of learning or the acquisition of degrees and certifications. So I don't mean performance in terms of like GPA or high grades or SAT scores. What I mean is it's also synonymous with educational attainment in years of learning. What I mean by intellectual character is just the totality of someone's habits of mind or thinking styles. And intellectual humility, I just mean at a minimum, our disposition to recognize that our beliefs could be wrong, that we are fallible in some of our opinions, beliefs. Intellectual humility is defined in several different ways, but at a minimum, that's what I mean, is our disposition to recognize that some of our beliefs and opinions might be wrong. By open-mindedness, I just mean a willingness to consider contrary perspectives, a diverse array of perspectives, especially those that are contradictory to our own. And by moral reasoning, I just mean the process by which someone determines whether a certain course of action is morally right or wrong. So on the problem and its significance, the reason that I thought that this research would be important is, for one, outside of the correctional educational context, quality education should address what has been variously defined as character, or those qualities of a person that are not cognitive in nature. And so in the correctional educational world, it's rare to find that as well. So with a few exceptions, I haven't found any published studies that have examined something identifiable as intellectual character of the currently or formerly incarcerated. There's plenty of studies in what they call criminal thinking styles. There are studies on moral reasoning using the actual test that I use, but nothing specifically on intellectual humility, open-mindedness, curiosity, anything that would be defined as intellectual character. The few exceptions I found, one of which was Dr. Bogosian in Portland State University did research about 15 years ago on critical thinking and moral reasoning among a group of inmates. And and one by Dr. Osei, who did something similar, were the only ones that I found that were specifically identifying not only critical thinking dispositions, but moral reasoning and virtue. So this study was intended to address the paucity of research on intellectual character among the formerly incarcerated, and draws a conclusion by implication about education broadly and correctional education specifically. My theoretical framework is intellectualist Aristotelian character education. Now that's a mouthful, and by referring to that, it is not as if ACE, which is what I'll call it, ACE, has a wealth of empirical research behind it. It is a perspective that has many different names. I just chose a paper by Fracani and Creed because it, again, sort of encapsulates what I'm getting at with Aristotelian character education. It's also called applied virtue epistemology. It's also called intellectual character education, or just Aristotelian character education. So there's a number of different names. But ultimately, it's a theoretical framework that draws on several different disciplines to say that development of intellectual virtues is beneficial, not only in the educational context, but for human flourishing as well. The empirical analog of the research is positive psychology, which is, as I have here, just the scientific theory of what goes right in life, or the study of optimal human thinking or human functioning. Positive psychology has an important relationship with a lot that is discussed in character education and virtue theory, virtue ethics. And so from positive psychology, we get the idea that these qualities of a person can be measured, and most of which can be increased through various interventions. So that's the key takeaway from positive psychology, is that virtues and character strengths that contribute to human well-being can be empirically measured and developed through intervention. There's a variety of subdisciplines that make use of positive psychology as a perspective to do their research. One of them is positive education, which sees character strengths as facilitating learning and achievement. And one that I recently found, which is, as far as I can tell, only about 10 years old, is people in criminology making use of the positive psychological framework applied to the correctional education setting. So in positive criminology, it's really just sort of an umbrella term of a variety of criminological theories that focus on the strengths and positive aspects of people and building them up so that they might flourish. What it says there is developing character strengths has the power to direct individuals away from deviance, behavioral disturbances, and distress. Something important to note is that I did not come into the study from the perspective of someone who has studied criminology or with an interest to say much about criminology, but things that I talk about in terms of intellectual humility and open-mindedness are relevant in that domain. In my literature review, I spent a lot of time elaborating on this philosophical framework of Aristotelian virtue theory. Spent more time on positive psychology and talking about the connections between the two, as well as character education, discussing dimensions of character and the qualities applicable to different areas of character. I also talked about correctional education, the scope of correctional education, which is largely consistent of career and technical education, although there has been a growing interest in post-secondary education. especially since now here just recently in December, Congress decided to restore Pell use for those who are incarcerated. So hopefully college will become more prevalent in the prison system. And there's also faith-based programs and therapeutic programs like AA and NA. I introduced the context of intellectual virtue by discussing non-cognitive qualities. Cognitive qualities are more like IQ and are measured as such by IQ tests and SAT scores and your general academic grading. Non-cognitive qualities is pretty much everything else. It's a sort of blanket term for things in the literature which are referred to as, for example, in psychology, personality traits, or in the economic and workforce literature, they might be called 21st century competencies, soft skills, social and emotional learning. All of these broadly fit under this blanket term of non-cognitive qualities. And in the last couple of decades, research has shown that these are also measurable, much like IQ, that they are malleable, meaning that they many of them respond to interventions, and that they are predictive of success in areas like academics, interpersonal relationships, and the workforce. So soft skills are one of those major sets of non-cognitive qualities for which research had been done in the last 20 or 30 years, as well as critical thinking dispositions, both of which have become important in the educational environment as a part of the normal curriculum. And so that's where we have intellectual virtues. Usually, virtue is understood in a philosophical sense, but the way they are defined and operationalized falls under the category of non-cognitive qualities. The two I focus on are intellectual humility and open-mindedness. I also include moral reasoning because in my initial research design, I needed to have some sort of a variable that the prison system would find valuable. And I didn't think that they would find humility and open-mindedness valuable, but there's a long history of research on moral reasoning. So I consider that to be a kind of intellectual virtue or something that contributes to intellectual character. So I talked about moral reasoning, some of the history in its measurement there. My methodology, this is a quantitative study. It's important to remember that originally my study was supposed to be a quasi-experimental study done inside of the prison with several hundred vocational students. But because of COVID, I had to redesign that. So last May, what I decided to do was take what I would have given students in a classroom setting and put it online as an internet survey of formerly incarcerated people. So it ended up being an online survey of formerly incarcerated people across the country. It was IRB approved by the university, as well as one participating community college through which a lot of the participants were recruited. And as far as my instrumentation, I used 5 basic instruments, 4 of which were self-report Likert scales. That is general intellectual humility, limitation zoning intellectual humility, open-minded cognition, and actively open-minded thinking. Throughout the rest of the presentation, I might say IHS, it should be LOIHS, OMC, and AOT, and that's what I'm referring to. I'll try to flip back and forth in case you are confused why I keep saying AOT, OMC, but those are the 4 self-report Likert scales that I used in the questionnaire. And the last one is the defining issues test. This one was much different. So the self-report scales consist of between 6 to 12 questions, just an agreement scale of agree, disagree, or whether or not those things you identify with. But for the defining issues test, it alone actually consisted of 85 questions. It was 5 moral dilemmas, and a participant would read a vignette about the moral dilemma and then decide on a course of action and then prioritize which issues were the most important in making that decision. So it was much more complex and comprehensive than the self-report Likert scales for the humility and open-mindedness. Also note that I use 2 different instruments for intellectual humility. My assumption was that they would relate well together. And I used 2 different instruments for open-mindedness for the same reason. I wanted to see whether they related well. My sample was a non-probability volunteer, so it was online. There were no incentives. Participants didn't receive anything for participating, so it was all volunteer basis. I originally had 254 participate, but the major criteria for eligibility was whether or not they had been incarcerated in a state or federal prison. 37 of them reported that they had not. So they were removed from the survey, which left me with 217. But those numbers were different depending on the research questions based on fulfilling all of the questions for the questionnaires. So for the intellectual humility question, there were 189 participants involved in that analysis. For the open-mindedness question, there were 203. And for the defining issues test, there were only 105. That is because the University of Alabama does the scoring for the defining issues tests and runs those through a reliability analysis, which looks for basically what we would call bogus data. So someone who just fills in, the same bubbles across, that would be meaningless data or exceptionally inconsistent data. And so through that reliability check, they reduced it to 105 participants. All right, so that was major review of the first 3 chapters, just to bring you up to speed on what actually happened. So here are my findings and results. First, something to say about the demographics. So there was 217 total who had acknowledged that they had been incarcerated in a state or federal prison. And from this, these are some of the demographic data. And at the bottom in orange, I just put, based on those numbers, what the average or the profile of the average participant looks like. So if you look in the ethnicity column, I had an overwhelming number of white. It was almost 64%. It was the majority male, 88%. And the age range was mostly between 36 years old and 55. So that comes out to someone in their mid 40s. And I asked about how much time they had served in prison collectively. And the 3-year to 10-year range is where most of them fell. And if you'll look at the education, let me do this to my screen. If you look at the highest education, the majority of them had an associate's degree or more. Now, the obvious thing that should jump out from this, if you have any sort of background or read anything about the incarcerated population, this sample is not representative of the incarcerated population in 2 senses. Number one, it's 64% white. It's overwhelmingly white. And it's also college educated. And the next slide, I'm going to talk about the education they had before, during, and after prison. But usually what you will read is that a person coming into the prison system has around a high school education. Certainly not many of them have completed college degrees. So in this sample, I have well-educated population, which affected some of the results, I believe. If you see there, I only had 1 person who had some high school and 9 people who had a GED or high school. So this affected the range of education in terms of my analysis. So with regard to college, I asked about what their college experience was before, during, and after prison. And if you'll see there, 27% had some college before prison and 28% had completed college before prison, which again, this is a much more well-educated sample than you would normally find. If you look at the column of after prison, 50% of them did not answer that question. So there are several possibilities. My assumption is that they just didn't answer it because they didn't attend any college. I think that's a reasonable conclusion, but 50% of them didn't answer that, whereas all of them answered the before prison and during prison question. So for research question 1, all I asked, again, was about statistical significance, but it being correlational data, the effect size is reported. And I would say something about power for one of the questions. But my first question was, is educational achievement defined by years of learning related to intellectual humility? Now, because I had 2 different scales or instruments for intellectual humility, that's actually 2 sub-questions, which is educational attainment related to general humility as it is defined by the IHS scale, and is educational attainment or achievement related to limitation zoning intellectual humility, which is the second scale. I had 189 participants in SPSS. When you exclude list-wise, it just takes out people who didn't answer everything fully, so that it's balanced. And so I had 189 participants. If you will look here at IHS, this is the general intellectual humility score, correlation coefficient of 0.047. is virtually no relationship. Its significance, 0.522, which is not even close to significant. So for general intellectual humility, there is virtually no relationship to educational achievement. If you look at this bottom portion where it says Cronbach's alpha, that's the reliability of the questionnaire itself, how well the items in the questionnaire are assessing a similar construct. And in its initial development and validation, in other words, the researchers who put together the questionnaire, it had a Cronbach's alpha of 0.82, which is a highly reliable or highly internally reliable scale. But in my sample, the reliability was a little bit lower at 0.777, but still reliable enough to trust what it says or that it is measuring a similar construct. For the second intellectual humility scale, the result was 0.120 for the correlation coefficient. So this is a little bit stronger than the intellectual humility scale. At 0.120 on most measures of effect size or strength and magnitude of relationship, 0.120 is going to be considered weak. The usual way that is reported is 0.1 is weak, 0.3 is moderate, 0.5 is strong. But there is argument to be made that in the social sciences, that should be a little bit less, such that 0.1 can reach the threshold of moderate and 0.3 would be strong. But in any case, according to what we have here, that is not significant, regardless of whether it's weak or strong or moderate, it's not significant at 0.100. And the Cronbach's alpha there, its initial validation was 0.86. This scale was developed in 2018. And in my sample, its initial or its reliability was 0.786. So high enough to be considered reliable. So for the second major question, I asked whether educational achievement was related to open-mindedness. For this one, I had 203 participants. Again, I used two different instruments for open-mindedness. The first was open-minded cognition, that is OMC. And the second was actively open-minded thinking, that is AOT. If you will look at the correlation coefficient here, it was negative 0.044, which, similar to the IH scale earlier, is virtually no relationship, and it is not significant at 0.533. Its initial Cronbach's reporting was 0.835. This scale was actually developed so that it could be used in three different ways. One way was just to assess the basic disposition of what they called open-minded cognition, which is willingness to accept a variety of perspectives. But then it can also be used simply by adding certain terms to assess open-minded cognition with regard to religion and politics. For all three scales, they had an initial reliability rating of 0.835. But in my sample, it was 0.411, which is unacceptably low. So that unacceptable level of reliability affected its relationship to the rest of the variables. In other words, the open-minded cognition scores didn't relate well to the rest of the variables when it should have. That is obvious just by looking at actively open-minded thinking. For actively open-minded thinking, I did get statistical significance. It's at 0.198, so almost 0.2, which could be seen as a moderate effect size in social science, or if we're going according to Cohen's traditional effect size, it's still weak, but it was significant at the 0.005 level. The AOT is different from OMC. The OMC scale was developed in 2015. The AOT scale that I'm using was put together in 2013, but actively open-minded thinking as a thinking style and with a measurement similar to what I've used has been used for almost 30 years in different versions. So when you look down there at the Cronbach's alpha, the reliability, I don't have just one figure. I have a range of figures because depending on which questionnaire, how many items were included in the questionnaire for any researcher, the reliability was slightly different. But in all of the reported research, the reliability for AOT questionnaires is from the 70s to 80s. In mine, it barely reached the threshold of acceptable reliability at 0.656. So that's higher than the other open-mindedness score, but still it could be better. So it's statistically significant, has a weak to moderate effect size, and it barely passed the threshold of reliability. And we did the a priori power analysis was, if you look down here, we did a two-tailed test. Its correlation or the effect size set at 0.3. So a moderate effect size is what you want to look for at an alpha significance of 0.5 and a power of 95. Power at 95 is really high. I didn't know that initially. What it's telling me is that if I want to reliably find a moderate effect size of 0.3, I needed at least a sample size of 138. So I did well over that with 203, but I didn't reach that 0.3 effect size threshold. It actually ended up being 0.198. So in the post-hoc analysis, I put a two-tailed test with a correlation of 0.198, remaining the same level of alpha significance, and put my sample size at 203. And it tells me over here that I had 81% power. 80% power is the bottom threshold for most social science. So this was an acceptable amount of power, or in other words, the likelihood that I found a true statistically significant results is 81. For the last question, I asked whether educational achievement was related to moral reasoning. Now, this one is just very different from the first several instruments. Again, the first several instruments were Likert scales. They are just asking about whether you agree or disagree with certain statements about humility and open-mindedness. But for the defining issues test, which was the test I used to assess moral reasoning, actually got 85 questions, and they're centered around a person's thinking process with regard to certain moral dilemmas. It assesses actually 12 different features, but 4 of them are relevant to the actual development of moral reasoning. If you look here, I included those 4 developmental indices. So PIS means personal interest schema. This is so people in the PIS level are reasoning through moral dilemmas basically on reciprocation and self-interest, whether or not the decisions in questions or the actions in questions are affecting them personally. The maintaining norms stage is whether people are reasoning through moral dilemmas according to existing legal frameworks and policies and cultural norms. Post-conventional is reasoning through moral dilemmas by engendering consensus and a recognition that not all moral dilemmas are going to fall into a certain framework that can be addressed by existing, legal structures. And N2 is not really an increased form of moral reasoning. N2 is the index of P2 as it relates to PIS, which is just to say, in the revised version of the test that I'm using, what they've done is looked at how often people answer questions at a post-conventional level and distinguish that from the personal interest schema. But in any case, I'm using N2 as my indicator of mature moral reasoning, and it was not related to educational achievement at 0.079. And that is not significant. I'm sorry, I have the word not significant in the wrong spot. Below that, significance is 0.423. The defining issues test has been well used for 30 or 40 years. The version that I used has been used about 30 years. It has a variety of internal reliability ratings. So again, a range from the 70s to 80s. But in mine, it was unacceptably low at 0.576, which affects the accuracy of the results. I also only had 105 participants in light of the way that the scoring process goes in weeding out what it considers to be meaningless data or bogus data. I had 3 basic questions. 2 of them were broken down into 2. Is educational achievement related to intellectual humility? Intellectual humility according to one scale, IHS, and a second scale, LOIH. And is educational achievement related to open-mindedness? One scale was OMC, one scale was AOT, and then was educational achievement related to moral reasoning? A couple of things to say about the results or any conclusions that I draw is that the results are not generalizable. I had 217 people is not a large enough sample to make any sort of generalizations about the formerly incarcerated population generally in Texas or the nation. And the results are not representative or they don't match the usual demographics of those who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. So conclusions on intellectual achievement and or educational achievement and intellectual humility. There wasn't a relationship. That question, intellectual humility in other research is related to a bunch of educationally relevant variables like epistemic curiosity or need for cognition. And so the sort of truism that I was thinking of with that question is the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. At least that's happened for me. And I know other people express that sentiment as they go throughout the course of their education. But in this sample, that was not the case. That were not the empirical results, is that the more a person progresses through the educational process, the more they will be intellectually humble, or the reverse. There just wasn't a relationship based on my results. This is not really news. When it comes to intellectual humility, the research is actually defined or distinguishes several things. One, the scale that I use assesses, again, it's called general because it's in contrast to specific. So a person can be intellectually humble in the sense that they recognize that their ideas and their beliefs and perspectives might be wrong in a general sense. But when it comes to specific issues like religion or politics or their educational area of expertise, they are not necessarily as intellectually humble. So being able to recognize your fallibility in certain areas is relative to the area being discussed. But in this sense, it's sort of intuitive that we recognize people in the world who are not formally educated, but we would consider them to be humble. We would consider them to be able to recognize their fallibility and that they are wrong. It's not always intuitive that we would associate that disposition with someone who has a lot of formal education. The opposite is that we also, I think, intuitively know people who are very well educated but are intellectually arrogant, who will not recognize that any of their ideas could possibly be wrong. So the fact that there wasn't any relationship between the two is not terribly surprising, even though I personally thought that it ought to be the case that the more one learns, the more they realize how much they don't know. But the empirical results, at least in my sample, say that there is no relationship. Now, when it comes to educational and achievement and open-mindedness, there was a stark difference that needs to be accounted for, because according to the open-mindedness cognition scale, there was no relationship. And as I'll show you here in a second, it didn't relate well to any of the other variables. But actively open-minded thinking was the one variable from which I got a statistically significant result. The difference there could be attributed to conceptual differences in the way that they are defined. So at least the way that I read the articles that talk about how they were validated, OMC is just saying that a typically open-minded person is one who is willing to consider contrary perspectives and ideas, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will actively pursue opposing or contrary ideas, where actively open-minded thinking does seem to emphasize, number one, the active pursuit of ideas that could be different, and the ability or willingness to change one's mind. So, for example, in the questionnaires, OMC didn't ask any questions that indicated one is willing to change their mind in the face of new evidence, or that changing your mind in the face of evidence is a good thing. But in the actively open-minded scale, 4 of the 7 questions indicated that changing one's mind is a good thing, and that someone who is actively open-minded will change their mind in the face of evidence. So there's a bit of a difference in the way that it's conceptualized that could have accounted for the difference. But there also, just remember the reliability at 0.411 is below the level of acceptability for reliability. There's something going on with the questions, and it also didn't relate well to any of the other measures. So open-mindedness in both scales, OMC and AOT, in other research shows a positive relationship to intellectual humility, that the two are conceptually similar, such that if the measures for them are valid, then there should be some relationship. But open-minded cognition didn't relate to any of the other variables. It didn't relate well with either scale of humility or actively open-minded thinking or moral reasoning. So something about that scale didn't work out well with this population. I also posited the idea that it could have been the placement in the survey. That was the first set of questions in the survey. And so it could have took a little bit before people realized what was required of them in terms of a Likert scale questionnaire. As it turns out, the instruments had higher reliability as it progressed through the survey. So that could have been a possibility. But in either case, whichever one of those is the answer, we still get the idea that actively open-minded thinking is significantly related to one's level of educational achievement. There is some evidence for this in the data. Openness to experience is a related construct in the world of personality traits. And within openness to experience, there are several different features, one of which is openness to ideas, which is similar to the open-mindedness construct. And that has been positively related to educational attainment the way that I am discussing it. So, for example, in terms of personality traits, conscientiousness is often associated with good performance, high grades, but openness to experience, openness to ideas is often associated with actual breadth of achievement or learning in years. So there is some evidence that this would be the case. And here's the table there, just so you can see quickly. OMC is highlighted in green and AOT is highlighted in orange. AOT related well. It was statistically significant relationship with both scales of intellectual humility and the moral reasoning. I figured it would relate well to intellectual humility. I wasn't sure about how it would relate well to moral reasoning, but then you see how OMC did it. It was in stark contrast to the way AOT related. So the variables of humility, open-mindedness, and moral reasoning did relate well, but OMC was kind of odd. With moral reasoning, is moral reasoning unrelated to education? The results showed no statistically significant relationship, very weak effect size. The low reliability of the instrument leaves the results in question. On this one, if it were the case that, so in this sample, if it is the case that is an accurate representation, that would run contrary to the well-established claims of research related to the DIT in education. In other words, for example, the University of Alabama and other research which reports the relationship of those who take the moral reasoning test in their education, that educational attainment does account for the differences in score, that it is related to education in an important way. When their educational range is from junior high through a PhD. My range was from high school through a PhD. If you remember from the demographic portion, all of them were really concentrated at the undergrad level. I didn't have very many at the high school GED vocational area, and I didn't have a lot in the doctoral level and a little bit less so in the master's level. So really the range of education that dominated my sample was an undergraduate degree. So in my opinion, that may have been one reason why I didn't get significant relationship between them. I just had a short range. It's not uncommon to get contrary results to other research, but the DIT, as far as I can tell, is related to education. But in my sample, it showed no relationship. One thing just quickly I wanted to say is that by saying that there is no relationship between humility and education or moral reasoning and education, it is not to say that the participants here were low in humility or low in open-mindedness or moral reasoning. That is a separate question. And especially with intellectual humility and open-mindedness, we don't know what the sort of average score of people would be. At least I haven't come across that, what the average scores of a person would be in AOT and intellectual humility. It's just to say that whatever a person's scores are, it's unrelated to formal educational achievement, which in my sample is college experience. That humility and open-minded cognition and moral reason is unrelated to the college experience. So some implications: humility, open-mindedness, mature moral reasoning, they're beneficial for the general population. Presumably, they're just as beneficial, if not more so, for the justice-involved population, given the circumstances that they deal with not only during incarceration, but post-incarceration. But none of these qualities, as far as my sample was concerned, except for the possible exception of actively open-minded thinking, were related to formal educational achievement. Some of this could have been because of poor reliability. It could have been because of educational range, and it could have been because of educational type. For example, the majority of them obtained their education while in prison. Most of prison education, even the college programs, are dominated by career and technical programs. Those are not the kind of programs that usually address higher order thinking styles like soft skills and critical thinking. So that could have been an indicator as well. I did not ask what the content of their education, what kind of degree, just the range, associate, bachelor. So there could have been quite a few reasons why there was no relationship. To the degree these students, college programs wanted their students to develop intellectual character, if something like critical thinking dispositions, humility, open-mindedness were a desired outcome of the colleges that they participated in, they didn't play any role. Some future recommendations based on limitations. So there were some limitations in the study. Number one, I shifted from a quasi-experimental study, and then 9 months ago, I turned it to an internet survey. So there were some limitations in that regard. I used self-reports. There's a lot of criticism about the use of self-reports. They have varying degrees of reliability depending on the way that they are worded. There are some things you can do to compensate for under-reporting or over-exaggerating on self-reports, but I could have included other reports. That would have been difficult in an internet survey. It was a part of my initial design. I was going to use teacher reports where another person reports on the similar scales, or performance tasks could be included in future studies. As I mentioned, I didn't come from this as a person who has studied much in criminology. I didn't come to it with a criminological perspective or with an intention to make a claim about criminal thinking styles. But some of the things that are involved in the study are relative to that. So in the future, I could do more to relate this kind of study to whatever the current research in criminology is. I could get a larger sample size. So it could be more generalizable and also more representative to the population of those who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. There was a large dropout rate for the defining issues test. That was not surprising since it was more comprehensive, took a little bit more time to do. Cohen, one of our texts, says that 15 minutes is really good for an internet survey. The defining issues test by itself could take up to 30 minutes. So I was not surprised that there would be a dropout rate, but just because of the shift in design, I needed to include it as best I could. I could also add additional instruments to measure non-cognitive qualities that are common and recognizable in the general public. So growth mindset is one that has been very familiar in the last 20 years, as well as grit and resilience. So intellectual humility and the research in that has really just gotten off the ground in the last 6 or 7 years. But I could have asked questions about those to see how they relate as well. And I could have controlled for confounding variables such as involvement in therapeutic and faith-based activities during their incarceration or in post-incarceration. I didn't ask any of those questions so that I could control for them. And then future recommendations based on emergent data. This was the most important, or not most important, but the most interesting part to me is that just in this process of learning how to do research, I found results that I wasn't looking for, wasn't asking for, but they were important enough, I feel, to warrant further consideration. One is obvious, is investigating the poor reliability of the open-minded cognition scale and finding out what was going on with its lack of validity and reliability. But the other was to investigate several statistically significant relationships that were not addressed by the research questions. So moral reasoning is positively or significantly related to IHS and AOT. So if you see there, the defining issues test was highly related to actively open-minded thinking and intellectual humility according to one of the scales. And it almost reached the threshold of significance for the limitation zoning intellectual humility scale. So this is interesting for a number of reasons, one of which is that there are interventions in the prison system and cognitive behavioral therapy and things directed towards moral reasoning that it's just interesting to me to see that there was such a strong relationship between what's going on in the way that participants reason through moral dilemmas and the actively open-minded thinking and intellectual humility. So also, if you just look at the HMLB at the side of the screen, one of the other facets of moral reasoning that the DIT measures is the degree to which a participant's response is related to professors of philosophy and political science. So in the early days of the DIT, what they recognized was that professors of philosophy and political science were getting high scores on the DIT, and that they were all similar. They were all answering in the same way. And so they just took that and used it as a point of comparison in the test. And so in this sample, the educational achievement was statistically significantly related to the humanitarian liberal disposition. It was the strongest relationship that I had, as a matter of fact, at 0.300, which on any measure of effect size is at least moderate, and was statistically significant at the 0.002 size. The other one was that the education was negatively related to the maintaining norms schema of moral reasoning, which is to say that the higher their level of education, the less likely they were to reason based on existing norms and legal structures. And the last one was the antisocial score. The defining issues test also measures the facet of antisocial score. What that means is a person's reflection on society and just sort of criticisms and complaints about society. And intellectual humility, one of the scales, was significantly correlated with antisocial in a negative way, such that the higher their score on intellectual humility, the lower their score on antisocial, vice versa. And I found this to be interesting because in the little reading that I did in criminology, what they call either antisocial personality disorder or antisocial friends, or the term antisocial is applied in a number of contexts to indicate high criminogenic need for people incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. And so as it turns out, that is negatively related to intellectual humility, and I felt like would be pretty interesting to pursue in a more substantive study. So concluding remarks, this research intended to be part of the conversation that intersects correctional and character education. I did notice in my writing, it was hard for me to divorce my initial design, which is intended to say something inside the correctional educational context versus just merely discussing the relationship for formerly incarcerated in terms of their humility and education. So at present, there are no published empirical studies on intellectual character or intellectual virtues among the currently or formerly incarcerated, at least not that I could find. There were a couple of ways that I went about trying to make sure I was, searching through the databases correctly, and also that this was not a subject that had already been deemed, insignificant or unimportant. And aside from Dr. Bugoshin and Dr. Osei's studies on critical thinking, moral reasoning, I just couldn't find anything that was specific to intellectual character, humility, and open-mindedness. But existing research on things like intellectual humility and open-mindedness show that it's positively associated with educationally relevant qualities, has potential for growth through intervention, produces desirable income or outcomes like better thinking and learning, increased ability to engage in civic dialogue, interpersonal relationships, mediating conflict, and having better overall well-being. Similar things can be said about open-mindedness. So one of the important things that I was trying to say here is that all of these benefits are seen in studies about humility and open-mindedness, but all of this is on just the general population, people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk or Qualtrics or whatever. And so if intellectual humility and open-minded bear these kinds of benefits, and to offer that sort of thing or to see what it's like for those who have been formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated would be important. So given the challenges of incarceration and post-incarceration, moral reasoning, humility, open-mindedness are just as valuable, if not more so, for people who have been involved with the justice system. More substantive research in the psychological correlates and values of the virtues should be pursued with a view to intervention design. And that is all I have.
Thank you, Brandon.
Excellent presentation, Brandon. I appreciate that. At this time, what we're going to do is we're going to open it up to the committee to ask questions. I'll start with Dr. Andres Garcia, the methodologist.
Brandon, excellent job in your presentation. I really enjoyed how you really got in depth with your instrument, your explanation of issues with validity and reliability. I think that was excellent. I just really think you had a good grasp as to the analysis and some of the limitations you were facing in the analysis. One of the things I did want to ask you was, you were looking at the measure itself, right, or the questions through correlations. But when you were, I guess, initially got the data, did you look at or find any percentages or anything that struck you as odd in looking at the actual results, like the level of agreement, I guess, on some of the items? Did that anything stand out or?
Well, I didn't have anything really to relate it to. So, for example, if the OMC scores, if they're the highest, whatever their highest rating is, I didn't have like a strong comparison, I guess, to see what would an average score look like versus what this samples looks like. I discussed that with Dr. Porter. I hadn't read any research that actually tried to sort of aggregate all those and come up with any sort of standard. So I was concerned about that. I wasn't sure if it was just because of my lack of understanding, because with a Likert scale where you only have a range of like 1 through 6 or 1 through 7, I just wasn't sure if that's a wide enough range. So there were no issues in that realm that I thought were odd. What was odd to me was the actual results of moral reasoning related to education and open-mindedness not relating well to any other variables. Those were some of the things that stood out as odd.
The another question I had, if you were to do this over again, this study, what would you change? Let's limit the list here, but what would you change? What would be some of the major factors I think that you would?
Well, I just would have asked more. And I know that in an internet survey, that's not ideal. I would have wanted to ask more about other variables like, therapeutic things that they've done, AA, NA, church and faith-based sort of activities, and then related it also to other variables that people recognize more, like growth mindset. So I want to ask more questions. I guess that's the quickest one I would say, and maybe break it up, because of the defining issues test. I knew I was going to have a bad result there, just because it was so long, and it was at the end of the survey after they've already answered. So ideally, my initial thoughts on it were that I was going to separate the two, so that defining issues test was on its own. And hopefully that wouldn't lead to such a high dropout rate. I would ask more questions and then maybe separated. It wouldn't have all been done in one sitting.
Did you come across any qualitative studies?
Well, the dissertation by Dr. Bogosian on moral reasoning was mixed methods. And so he went into the classroom and transcribed his interviews with the students.
Oh, okay, cool.
And he did find some increase in their moral and critical thinking, specifically with regard to self-regulation. But that was it. That was like the only thing. Most of what you find in the correctional education or criminological world is cognitive behavioral therapy. And there is moral recognition therapy. And there's a bunch of different names for something that reduces to cognitive behavioral therapy.
Overall, I thought you did a great job.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia. At this point, we'll open it to Dr. Porter, who's our practitioner.
Hey, thanks, Brandon. I just echo what Dr. Garcia said. Well done. And I commend you for your persistence and adaptability going through this and getting a dissertation done during this global pandemic. Has not been easy, or something that most of us faced when we were doing our dissertations. I certainly didn't. So you've shown just a lot of tenacity to complete the goal. So congrats and well done. I did have a question about your thoughts on the relationship between moral reasoning and intellectual humility and open-mindedness. I can think of times or circumstances where it might be sort of immoral to be really intellectually humble about a certain issue. So I'm not particularly intellectually humble about my views on child labor or something like that. But then again, I can think of times where it seems immoral to not be intellectually humble or open-minded. So there's sort of interesting paradoxes there. And I just wonder if you could speak to, how you interpret this positive correlation and what you think about the relationships between those constructs.
So, moral reasoning was sort of my proxy for the virtue of phronesis in Aristotelian thinking, it's also been called judgment, practical reasoning, just the ability to use one's knowledge in a given context and to do it well and make good judgment. The way the defining issues test works is not exactly a measure of phronesis, but it's all I had available. So when we're thinking about some moral issues like child labor or torture or some of these, we have this sort of knee-jerk reaction to be open to the possibility that your intuitions are wrong on those issues or right. Yeah, to me, that's, it's hard to answer because I guess that is one of the things that interested me about the study is there a way that we can see some sort of a baseline where we can say, my intuition, I have this sort of knee-jerk intuition about this issue. For me to even consider the possibility that I might be wrong would in itself seem immoral. And, so like, where do we draw the line? I don't have an easy answer for, largely because I think that all of these issues are diverse enough that it's hard to draw or come up with certain principles or rules. Like when you encounter this situation, this is how you act. When you encounter this situation, this is how you act. And so, the interrelationship between them is just difficult for me. I think it should be relative to circumstance. But the actively open-minded person, at least as I understand it, is at least going to recognize that they should pursue understanding how someone would come to these certain views in order to make a reasonable decision about it, so that they wouldn't just be making it in a sort of a simplistic or naive way, like, oh, this is what you think about torture. To be open-mindedness, I must accept it. The actively open-minded person would seek out or do a little bit more investigation as to why that would even be coherent. When it comes to how that would relate to intellectual humility, I think on the one scale of limitation zoning humility, a love of learning would indicate that someone who is humble would do the same thing in that regard. I don't know. I'd have to think more about the relationship between those two. But as a rule, that is something that there can't be a lot of mechanical rules in place for every situation. It's relative to context. And I think that being more open-minded and humble helps us make better judgments in those murky and ambiguous.
Great, thank you. I wonder what your thoughts are on the fact that you found a negative correlation between the limitation zoning intellectual humility scale and antisocial behavior, and no correlation between the general intellectual humility scale and antisocial behavior. So I know those scales are a little bit different, quite a bit different, but how do you interpret those discrepant findings? If I'm wrong about that, let me know.
No, so I know clearly that the limitation zoning scale has the 3 subscales, one of which is love of learning, one of which is an appropriate discomfort with limitations, and the other is willingness to own limitations. to the degree that those are accurately assessing those things, only 2 of those subscales were related to the antisocial score, which I think, if I go back, was love of learning and discomfort with limitations. If I remember correctly, the way they cash out antisocial score, it's an irritation with the status quo, but lacking a substantive response to the status quo. In other words, it's just sort of a complaint. It's a disposition to just sort of complain with no positive response. And so potentially a person who has a love of learning and an appropriate discomfort with their limitations would recognize that the way that they perceive society could potentially be wrong. The owning limitations one usually indicates that if you are owning your limitations, you're doing something about it. You're doing something to either change that limitation or accept it. But that one was not correlated with the antisocial one, which would indicate that the kind of person who owns their limitations is also, just my thoughts immediately there were that the person who has sort of significant problems with the status quo, but no positive or substantive answer or solution to that, is not the person who is apt to recognize he's wrong. I think the person who is in a state of complaint has made a judgment about the situation. They've made a judgment. They have a certain degree of certainty about the situation in a way that a person who's intellectually humble wouldn't have that degree of certainty or judgment in a negative way. So I think I would have to say more about its relationship to judgment, because to make a negative or positive judgment and to do it against society as a whole indicates that you're pretty confident and certain about your assessment. And someone who's intellectually humble may not have such a strong negative assessment without some, positive response to it.
Great.
These are the kind of questions that I would rather reflect on in an essay, but I guess that would be my general answer, is that to pass a judgment in that sort of a way, such that you are irritated with the status quo, means that you're pretty sure you have good reasons to be irritated in that way. And someone who recognizes the possibility that they might be wrong will be less inclined to have that sort of a response. And now I'm thinking even more about this, because having an antisocial disposition doesn't necessarily mean you're emotionally engaged, but I know intellectual humility is related to less of an emotional reaction to disagreement, that they're not as prone to be emotionally negatively reacted to disagreement. And so that might also have something to do with the antisocial disorder. I don't know that it implies any sort of emotional engagement. I'm just assuming that it does.
Any other questions, Dr. Porter?
I can hold or ask one more.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. So you've done this work, and I guess as a person representing practitioners on this panel, I wonder what your thoughts are on ways to cultivate these virtues through education. So it's clear you didn't find a lot of associations between just general education, but we didn't have a lot of information about the kinds of education that your participants had received. And so what do you think is really important in a classroom to teach or try to cultivate these intellectual virtues? Do you think, for example, people should learn the definition of intellectual humility, or is it more important that a teacher would model that to students and create a classroom that's welcoming or accepting of displays of intellectual humility? Or kind of what are your just intuitions about how we could foster it in the classroom?
Yeah, it'd be hard for me to give my opinion divorced from what I have read in people like Dr. Jason Baer or Dr. Rickert or others who have done this sort of work. It'd be hard for me to say anything unique or novel. I do think, at least in my own mind, that there is value in direct instruction in what an intellectual virtue is and what open-mindedness is, so that people are clearer on what the concept looks like. And I think especially open-mindedness, not so much humility, but open-mindedness, like most people see it as a good thing and think that they are that. But then when asked to explain exactly what that means, they'd be hard pressed to do so. But in the absence of a clear understanding of what it is, then it would be harder to relate, assignments or practices or training in that area. But this is where the moral exemplar comes in. So like in Aristotelian or any sort of virtue theoretical perspective, there's the teacher actually serves as the sort of moral exemplar who does, in fact, model these. Of course, then the question is, how do you get the teacher and make sure that they model all of these? But there is a sort of dynamic there where students observe someone engaging or manifesting those. The other thing is time. None of the thinkers, empirical or even speculative philosophers who have advocated for this sort of thing, believe that there's like a quick fix or a transformative sort of eye-opening moment where a person goes from not being virtuous to being virtuous. It's all in a matter of degrees and over time, and also indicates the need for practice, which in my own context is why I thought that this people in a correctional environment would excel. They have plenty of opportunities to practice engaging with others and being open-minded and changing their minds if necessary. For example, out here in what we would call the world, people engage with each other over social media, and they have the opportunity to lie and say all sorts of things and have no incentive to really engage another person. But in prison, you're face to face with another person, and you need to deal with that opposing perspective in a constructive way. So I think a lot of practice, direct instruction in what those things are, and even discussions about differing views of what constitutes open-mindedness and its relationship to things like religious faith. Then the moral exemplar or an environment in which the value of those things are promoted is also important. So in that regard, I haven't said anything novel by pointing to direct instruction, practice and training, proper environment, and moral exemplars. And when I think of those things in the correctional context, there's a lot that can be done there.
Thank you, Dr. Porter. All right. Excellent job, Brandon. So far, you're on the roll. All right. Can you put your presentation back up, please? Please share your PowerPoint. And if you'll go to the slide that has the participants overview, the demographic.
You see that?
Okay. Yes, sir. Thank you. All right. So, Brandon, what is the what is the actual prison demographic today? It doesn't have to be exact. So I think you referred to it that you had a small sample and it wasn't representative. What is a representative number of? Break it down just by ethnicity.
A higher proportion of African Americans to the general population, as well as Hispanics. That's what I think you would normally read. But like in Texas, in particular, maybe 2 years ago, when I was looking at this, the absolute percentages of the races was actually in thirds, almost 30% between white, Hispanic, and African American. I don't know that that's representative of the rest of the United States, but if that were the case, a third of the population being African American and Hispanic, then that would be disproportionate to their actual population in society. So,
that's good.
I could say other things related to education, but I think that is here, at least here in Texas, that's what it stands. It's
all right. So let's assume it's a third, a third, and a third. What would you do differently so you could get a representative from each of the three ethnic groups that we're talking about? Now, I can tell you personally, sometimes when I get a survey, I ignore it, and I know I shouldn't do it, simply because I'm so busy sometimes that I don't do it. How would you, to get a more accurate picture of what you want to find out, how would you structure a next dissertation? Or how would you advise a future student, a doctoral student, to devise the dissertation so they could actually get a third, and a third?
Well, right. So one of my limitations was just the groups through which I recruited students were more likely to be educated. So I didn't directly try to recruit at like a local, parole office or institution. There were just more problems doing that, but not addressing, in other words, opening up the different ways that I recruited in, parole offices and things like that. I didn't do any of that. So a larger absolute number of people in the population would do that best, but also I would have to find some way to get more of a random sample because the way that I got my sample was just through various groups that I knew or had heard of, and it was a volunteer sample. So a larger absolute number of people would get at it better, but then also the kinds of groups that I talk to get participants also needs to be widened.
Excellent. And I remember the panic situation you were in when the pandemic hit. How is this going to impact my study? And you had to go back to the drawing board. So
and also I think that's pretty, I want to say it's pretty standard when you look at things like Amazon's Mechanical Turk or some of these online repositories of information. A lot of the people who are taking them are college educated. To get a sample of people who may not be educated or college educated, or just to get a wider sample of your standard white college educated person, doing it online also it may not be the best and most efficient way. I mean, there's access to internet. That was another issue I was concerned about, is especially if someone had just gotten released from prison, did they even have access to internet or the ability to take this sort of survey? So internet access could have been a crutch. So just different mediums through which to do the survey.
All right. Excellent. Can you go to the slide that talks about your conclusion?
The final conclusion, or?
Okay. No, go back to when you go to research question 1, conclusion. I just wanted to make sure you had the alignment and, okay. So you do have alignment. You have your citations there. I didn't remember seeing those, but you have that there. That's important. All right. I think Dr. Garcia asked you, like, what were the moments? What was an aha moment? What surprised you with the data that you received or with the end result?
Well, sure. So just as an admission of my own naivety, my own limitations here, I assumed that there would be, positive correlation and that would be a good thing. So initially, my original design was looking at growth. Like Dr. Porter asked me whether or not a person can actually increase in humility, more reasoning, open-mindedness. And my assumption in that case was that it could, and that's how I sort of set things up. So in my mind, I was thinking that positive relationship would just be a good thing regardless. However, if I wanted to make the case that training or exposure to things that could help increase intellectual humility and open-mindedness were a missing component in correctional education. And then it turned out that there was a statistically positive relationship between those things and college education. Then it just means add more college education or add more of whatever is already being done. The fact that there's really no relationship between any of them and the educational experiences that they've been through, to me would indicate that assuming interventions work, something else needs to be added. Something other than the existing educational programs would need to be incorporated. Open-mindedness, humility, more reasoning were a desirable outcome. Well, I think that it is, and I think that interventions would work, but all of that is a separate question about its value and increase their intervention.
Excellent. All right. So you've been working on this project for 3 years, correct? What have you learned, not about content, what have you learned about Brandon Warren?
That I'm not intellectually humble. No, I need to do more work in psychometrics and statistics, and I don't have this sort of numerical aptitude to easily just sort of flow through some of these instruments and their implications into statistics. So, I'm interested in pursuing this further, but there are still a lot of things that I need to work on in order to do it well.
All right. So I know you are very humble, and I know in class I embarrass you a lot. I want you to tell me, what did you learn about your character, Brandon Warren's character? Not about your knowledge with this dissertation, about you personally. What did you learn about yourself? And I know you don't like talking about yourself. So what did you learn about Brandon?
I don't know. It's hard for me to give an impromptu response about that. I was, as I went through these things, I was assessing myself, which I think everyone does in a psychology class or a medical class. Every time you learn about a new trait or condition, you start to think whether or not you have this trait or condition. And so in assessing myself against things like humility and open-mindedness, I was more, I think I learned to be more honest about whether or not I manifested those sort of qualities and what I could do to do it better. So, for example, in areas of intellectual humility or willingness to admit that I was wrong, that actually was a revelation to me just a couple of months ago. As I was going through the data, and I didn't see any sort of positive relationships there, and I was irritated. But in that irritation, I learned a whole lot more about the way these things ought to be measured, their relationship to education generally. And so that sort of hit me in December, and I emailed Dr. Porter about it because I just felt embarrassed about some assumptions I made. But then in that moment, I realized that acknowledging that I was wrong about certain things, that being embarrassed about it was not an intellectually humble response. And so, yeah, that's in a sense, I do mean that relating myself to these various virtues, I think I was a little bit more honest about how I measured up and what I could do differently personally to embody some of these things that I find to be important.
All right, so let me add to your list, because I think, number one, you're very flexible. Sometimes I might not see you being embarrassed or you having these other things, but you're flexible. You don't have tunnel vision, and you stick to that. So that's what I'm talking about, your flexibility. You see that you had one way of doing your project at the beginning. That's what we thought we were going to do. The pandemic arrived and you went to plan B. That's what I'm talking about, flexibility. I see that in you, all right, in the last 3 years. I also see that you have a passion for this topic. And I just can't imagine somebody telling you can't do this topic. We want you to research earthquakes. You have a passion for this. And then I think your persistence to the topic, regardless of the situations that arise, you persisted. And I think that's important. That's a quality that you have that I see. Does that make sense? This is my final question. What are you going to do with this study?
Well, I just want to do more. I feel like I needed more. I needed more questions. I needed more samples, and I just want to pursue this sort of thing into the future. I do think it's important. Some missing components in your average educational program is just to focus on the memorization of content or learning new skills when that doesn't necessarily have any bearing on a person's character, which is increasingly important in society. So it's just a passion of mine. I think these are some things that need to be incorporated, but in order to make that claim, more research, more studies need to be done to have some support for that claim. So, I would like to take this further on the assumption that I can increase my statistical know-how.
Very good. I encourage you to do that. And I encourage you to think about what Dr. Porter said about can the K-12 people do something? I encourage you to follow that track. Is there something that teachers are not doing now? Once they leave K-12, they say that it's the, what is it called? The pipeline to prison. Mm-hmm. If we don't give the students this information that you have, look at that avenue of research, because I think that's critical. What happens is the students leave public ed or private ed, and it's obvious these people had an education, but do they know these skills? And I just think to follow up on that, do not leave your dissertation on your shelf. All right. Look at your future research that you have, see what you can do about it. Any other questions, Dr. Porter, Dr. Garcia, before we go to deliberation? All right, very good. Dr. Thompson?
Okay, great. Thank you. Wonderful job, Brandon. It was a delight to be in your presentation. And I think your Facebook family will feel the same way. At this time, I'm going to disconnect the live stream, but I ask that our audience stay close by. We're going to put up a little just picture to let you know that we are in deliberation. As a reminder, the deliberation is just the committee in which they discuss Brandon's research and decide if he has passed the defense. So I encourage you to stay near the computer so that when we go live again, you'll be there to witness the end result and last input from the committee. So stay close by.